So we talked the other day about some of the reasons why we study history. And one of the reasons that we stated was that we would learn from the past mistakes of others. And I did not get a chance to get to this slide the other day, but I wanted to bring it up here before we go in and talk about the creation story because of an event that happened in the 1930s, 1940s known as the Holocaust. So remind me a little bit, what was the Holocaust? What do you know about it? What happened during that time? Oh, what happened there?
The Holocaust was when Hitler decided the Jews were the problem in the world and decided to kill all of them.
Okay. So Adolf Hitler was the leader of what country? Germany. And he decided that he was going to eliminate the Jews. Was it just limited to Jews? No, it was all kinds of different people that he deemed as undesirable. So if you had any sort of physical deformity, if you did not have the right hair color, if you had the wrong sort of belief system, if you were too radical in your religious views. Yes, sir? Mm-hmm. In fact, a lot of those people with disabilities, they were the test subjects for many experiments that they were doing with medication, even some forms of chemical and biological warfare that they were experimenting with. They would take those people because they wanted to see how their bodies would respond. And there are some pretty graphic details, if you go to the Holocaust Museum, that talk about some of those scientific experiments that they did on people just because. Yeah. So we look back at the Holocaust as a terrible time in our world's history. But the Holocaust was an isolated in one event in many throughout the course of history that have happened in a very similar fashion. How many of you are aware of Joseph Stalin? You know who Joseph Stalin is, okay? We talked about him earlier in the year. I forgot about that. We did. So we talked about how he did some very similar things. He killed many more people than what Adolf Hitler did. And yet, how many of you are aware that there are countries in the world that are making it a law where textbooks are not allowed to have events like the Holocaust printed in their textbook in the schools? I think it was 2016, if I remember correctly. There was a movement in Europe to wipe out any reference to the Holocaust from textbooks that were taught in the public schools because it was offensive to the German people. And it was also, there was some concern that perhaps it was propaganda, that it was something that was elevated bigger than what it really what really happened. And so they said, maybe we need to eliminate that. We need to wipe it out of the history books because we're not sure if everything was exactly accurate or not. Some schools adopted that and they no longer teach the Holocaust. Many schools, though, however, said, whether it's in the textbook or not, we're still going to teach it because it's part of history. General Dwight Eisenhower was the leader of all of the American troops on the ground. He was the man who helped lead the invasion to Normandy on D-Day. And he helped to lead the troops into Europe and eventually get into Germany. And he came across one of the camps, and this is one of the things that he said. The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence, the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things, if ever in the future, 2016, there develops a tendency to change these allegations merely to propaganda. I mean, he didn't know what was going to happen that many years in the future, but yet that's exactly what's happening. People are wiping out pieces of history because it's uncomfortable to talk about, it may be offensive to others, or they just question its authenticity. And we look at a story like the creation story that you just read in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, and what do people say about that story? What? Yeah, I did. I just didn't hear you. It's fantasy. That's a fairy tale. It's a Bible story. So somebody made that up. And that's what's being taught in our culture and taught so many places around the world because we have failed to defend it. We have failed to say, no, this is reality. This is what God's Word says. This is how God created it. And just like we think it's ridiculous for people to wipe out something like the Holocaust and say, well, that never happened. Why is it not equally as ridiculous for people that say, well, God didn't create the world. It just happened. We are self-evolving creatures. All kinds of things that are being said on that. Just in connection here with why it's important to remember history and why it's important to stand up for truth, this is a quote by a Lutheran pastor that lived in Germany during World War II. And he says this, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. That is a very powerful statement, and that is written on the wall as you exit the Holocaust Museum, reminding us of our duty to share the stories of history and to stand up for what's right. But how do we know what's right? How do we define truth? How do we define right? I'm asking, I want you to think about that, and I want you to throw out some answers. How do we define what is true and what is right? Zay? Okay, so we can ask other people. How else?
The Bible.
We look at the Bible. Okay. What else?
Yes, God.
Ask God to reveal it to us through prayer. And it depends on where your source of truth lies. If I were to ask you to write an essay, which I won't, but if I were to ask you, where is your foundation or source of all truth? How would you start writing that essay? If it's on something other than the Bible, does that truth change? Yeah, it depends on your circumstances. It depends on your friends. It depends on your environment. But the Bible is timeless. The Bible is forever. The Bible is God's Word. And that's where our foundation needs to be rested upon. So in our American society, when we think about truth, so many people are telling us, well, truth is relative to the situation. Well, we tell the truth if it's convenient for us. Or we find truth, and I heard somebody say, I've heard this before, we find truth in ourselves. That's a horrible philosophy. Because again, we are desperately wicked. We talked about human depravity the other day, and we are deceitful, we are sinful, so finding truth in ourselves is not biblical, and it's certainly not a wise way to live your life. We find truth in God's Word. That is foundational truth. And if we base everything upon that, then we can now begin to form our worldview correctly and understand the beginnings here of world history. Question?
This is kind of unrelated to that.
That's okay.
But that quote,
Yeah.
wasn't the Nazi Party a socialist party?
Yes, so there was a movement in the Socialist Party to eradicate all people that were kind of half-hearted socialists. So Hitler went through and he did a cleansing within the party because he wanted to make sure everybody was loyal to him. And even people that were loyal to him, he had executed just because he wanted to create fear within the party. I like this comic, these two computers talking to each other. Oh my, no. Humans didn't invent us at all. We were evolved from plastic wires and little micro thingers. That's the same thing that, I mean, as ridiculous as that is, so is it to think that we came from nothing. We are created by an incredible God. Now, as we look through the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, what does it say in verse 1? What did God create? Genesis 1:1. way back in the beginning? What did God create? Heavens and the earth. Okay? How were they created? Okay, through God. But how did God create the heaven and the earth? He spoke it, and in what... I don't think I'm asking this well enough. Okay, in his image, it was created, he describes it later on, and his creation was good. Okay. What does that term good mean? As he created all things good? Holy, perfect, what? Uncorrupt. Yeah, all those are good descriptions. What else? In harmony with each other. Okay? So God created heaven and earth. And I think sometimes in our minds we think, well, God created heaven, that's like the spiritual place, and earth, he created as the sinful place. That's not what verse 1 says, is it? He created heaven and earth, and it was good. So heaven was good, earth was good. And then what was the problem? And I don't think chapter 2 doesn't get to it. We get there in chapter 3, but you all know the rest of the story. What corrupted earth? Sin. And that sin is what has affected us today. I want to get into some of the beginnings here in our notes as well as we look into creation. So in the beginning, God, Jehovah, created the world, and he did it through speaking. And can you just imagine what that would have been like? Here is the holy God of the universe, and he just opens his mouth, and out of his mouth comes this entire universe just screaming out of his mouth, and boom, it's there. Wouldn't you love to have been one of the angels? That you've witnessed what God has done. You've witnessed all kinds of things in heaven, but yet all of a sudden now God is creating this universe out of nothing. I don't know, maybe you wouldn't want to be there. That might be a terrifying experience too. So he spoke, and all things came into existence. And that right there should help us to have an awe of who God is. And this term divine sovereignty, it describes God's control, God's authority over all the world. So because he made it, he has control over heaven and earth, from Genesis chapter 1. Any of you into Legos when you were younger? Yeah? When you were young? Yeah, nobody would admit to it now. Okay, we're over Lego. Oh, some of you would. Okay, hey. No, all right, no judgment here. I do play with my son with his Legos. I do step on them occasionally when he leaves them out, and those are not fun. But you create something with Legos, or maybe Play-Doh, and none of us expect that creation to start moving on its own and to talk back to us and tell us how to recreate it, how to make it. That'd be a little scary and a little weird. We expect to create something the way we want it to be made and to function the way we want it to function. So my son Logan, he loves Legos, and he, for as long as I can remember, has been creating things with them. In his younger years, he was only creating according to the instructions, basically the first half of the Lego movie. So he was creating according to the instructions. He wouldn't ever deviate and come up with his own things. Some of you have never seen a Lego movie, you're missing out. So then a few years ago, he started deviating and coming up with his own thing. He says, Dad, I made this. I added this part on because I wanted to have this extra piece. I wanted to have a garage for this. And I'm like, hey, that's pretty cool. Because he had an intent and a reason why he created it. Have you ever thought about that's the way God created us? God created you and me for a specific intent and purpose. And he doesn't need us to sit there and say, hey, God, yeah, I know this is the way you created me, but I'd really love to be a little different. So can you change me? Because I think you messed up. You know, God, I know these are my parents that you, in your sovereignty and your control, you gave me these parents, but I'd really love to have that guy's parents because they're awesome. Or, God, you know, I know you've put me in this school here, and yeah, Christian school is probably good for me, but I'd really love to be somewhere else. So, God, you know, because you want my happiness above all else, why don't you just change your whole plan for me? I realize none of us would verbally say that, But yet, is that the way that we act sometimes? Is that the way that we talk to God? Instead of talking to God, and yes, He does want to hear our requests, but remember the book of James tells us that we have not because we ask not, or because we ask amiss. We ask wrongly, without accordance with God's will. That's the idea here of divine sovereignty, is that God is in control of His creation, and that He has authority over it. So there are times where God says, yeah, you know what, you want to have your circumstances change? Okay, I will allow you to have your circumstances change, but you're going to have to deal with the consequence of that. I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience before, but I know I have, where you pray to God for something for a long time. Man, I really want this, I really want this, I really want this. God, can you help this happen? And it just doesn't seem to be happening. And you're wondering, man, why in the world is God not letting this happen? And all of a sudden it happens. You're like, whoa, okay, that was maybe not the right thing. Any of you ever had that experience? Maybe not yet. A couple of you have? Okay. Maybe I should have asked. Yeah. Divine sovereignty. God knows what you need. I know I've had that type of situation, and I've been there, and I've said, okay, God, yes, you do know best. So when you tell me to wait on something, or you tell me no, I need to accept that answer. So God has control of His creation. That includes you and me. We do not have the power or the authority to go to God and to say, this is how you should do things. Now, when God created man, He created man differently than He created all of the rest of His creation. Hopefully you saw that as you read through Genesis chapter 1 into the latter part of Genesis chapter 2. He created mankind much differently, and so we are distinct. We're the only part of creation that God says you are created in God's image. No other part of creation does God talk about His image other than with mankind. So what does that mean? How are we created in God's image? What does it mean to be created in God's image? Does that mean that God looks like a mixture of all of us into one person? Or does He look like me? Some of you are like, I bet He better not look like you. So what does it mean to be made in God's image? How are we made in God's image? We hear that a lot in Scripture. So we probably better understand what that means. What do you think?
We less reflect His appearance and more His character.
Character, yeah. Character-wise. Now, when we look at the character of God, there are a number of things that we could examine there. There's unique characteristics of reason. No other part of creation has the ability to reason. Morality. I think we don't have to look very far to realize that the animal kingdom does not have a great deal of morals. Though you could say that for some humans as well. Spiritual desire. We are all created with the desire to worship something. As much as somebody may say, no, I'm an atheist, I am not worshiping anybody, I am doing my own thing because it makes me feel good, because I want to do it, and nobody's going to tell me what to do. Who are they worshiping? Themselves, yeah, exactly. We all have a desire to worship something. It's just a matter of what we decide we are going to worship. Emotions. We've been created uniquely in all of those ways. And so how do we know how God would respond or how God would use these characteristics? How do we know these characteristics of God or know about them? What do you think? Okay, we have the example of Christ. Yes. How else? Jai? The Bible. Ever done a name study of God? It is one of the most humbling things that I've ever done, where you go through the Old Testament names in the original languages, and please buy a book. Don't just sit there and look at the Greek words. It won't mean a whole lot to you unless you go study Greek or Hebrew. I guess I should say Hebrew. But you get a book that talks through the names of God, and you think about what all of those names mean as they are used in Scripture. And I find it very interesting how the names of God are unique for each situation. And God reveals different aspects of His nature as you progress through the Old Testament. He is not called all these names at one time. He is called individual names based off of, is He God the provider? Is He God the gracious? Is He God the sustainer? And that's exactly what the people needed at that time. And when we understand more about who God is, it helps us live more like Him. He's given us a unique opportunity to share a relationship with Him. He did not extend this opportunity to all of His creation. He extended this opportunity here to mankind. So this leads us into mankind's purpose. This is called the creation mandate. This comes from Genesis 1:28 that you should have read through. It says, "Be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." So this is the creation mandate. That is a term that you need to be familiar with. You need to know the creation mandate. You also should be familiar with Genesis 1:28. I'm not going to ask you to quote it or memorize it, although I would suggest this is a great verse for you to memorize for your own personal walk with God. But know the creation mandate comes out of Genesis 28 and link those two together so that you are familiar with those things. So what does this mean for us, and what is this talking about? First of all, creation mandate says that we should carefully use the earth and everything in it to help us to survive and advance our culture. So God's given us the ability to take the things that He created and to modify them and to change them for our own sustenance and for advancement of our culture. But be wise with those sources that we have. And so God's given us the power to have control over the fruit of the earth. It doesn't mean we have to go out and hug the trees and to rip on anybody that's going to be an environmentalist or anything like that, but understanding our purpose in why God's given us these things is to advance culture, take care of the earth, and that does mean that we need to be wise with these resources that God's given to us, not be wasteful of them. The mandate also means that we need to be working together with others. We are not an island. We should not isolate ourselves. We should not keep ourselves away from other parts of the world. We are to work together. And we get this term civilization, which means city. I don't think this information here is going to show up on the screen, so I would encourage you to write some additional things down here as I talk about civilization. Civilization means city. And it's talking about human culture that lives in the civilization or in the city and is influenced by the city. So civilization involves not only just the city itself, but also the culture surrounding the city that's affected by the city. And that's part of what we're going to study. We're going to study different civilizations, different cities, different groups of people, their culture, how they interacted with their environment around them, and how that environment affected who they are. That also leads us to a term known as specialization. Every successful civilization is going to specialize in the way that they operate and the way that they conduct themselves. So specialization is a division of labor within the city. It's a division of labor. It's a way for them to work together so that you don't have to do everything in order to survive. You don't have to work all jobs to make the city work. You find one job that you're good at, and you do it as a piece in the entire civilization. So if we did not have specialization, do you realize how difficult it would be to do something as simple as bake a cupcake? If you think about all that you would have to do just to bake a cupcake without specialization, you got to start from the beginning. Where do you start? You're going to have to buy some chickens. You have to get some chickens. And we're not going to go into the chicken or egg debate right now, which came first. If you need to buy a chicken first or buy an egg first, I'm not going into that. But you need to have chickens. You need to have those chickens make some eggs for you. Okay, so we've started one area. What else do you need to have happen? You're going to need a cow in order to have the milk. And then once the cow produces the milk, what do you have to do with the milk? Process it. You're going to need butter for your... You're going to have to churn your butter. You got to do that by hand. Churn your own butter. How about the flour? Where's that come from? Yeah, you got to grow your own wheat. You got to make some flour, but you got to till the soil first. You got to plant the seed. You got to wait about 6 months for that. Well, maybe it's not quite 6. Maybe it's 3 or 4 months. And then you have to harvest the wheat, and then you have to crush it, grind it down into a fine powder. Now you're ready to make cupcakes, but we're still missing a couple ingredients. We're missing some sugar, aren't we? Baking powder. Man, makes it really tough, doesn't it? Instead, all we have to do is we go to the store and we say, flour, eggs, milk, sugar, butter. Yes, put it in my cart. I go home. That is part of the result of specialization, because you have a farmer who knows how to raise the crops. You have a processing plant that knows how to grind that flour. We have specialized. It makes our civilization work so much better. Now, some civilizations struggle with specialization, and they don't do that so well, and that's part of the reason why they don't advance. But most of them do to some extent. Let's talk about the first man and the mandate. Who was the first man? Adam. Okay, good. We are familiar with Adam. So Adam is told to have dominion over the earth, and he exercised that. We see an example of that at the middle of chapter 2, or maybe it's the end of chapter 1, where he names all the animals. So God gives him that responsibility. He names them. You don't see God hovering over his shoulder saying, oh, Adam, nope, that's not supposed to be a zebra. That should be something else. Giraffe, that's really not a good name for that. God gives him the liberty and the ability to name all those, and he exercised dominion there. And he realizes at the end of naming all the animals that he could not fully complete the creation mandate without a proper mate. And he goes to God and he says, look, you've provided a mate for all these other animals, but I don't find anything that suits me. And this is not Adam just being picky and saying, man, none of these, like I see in high school dating relationships, man, none of these girls are pretty enough, so I'm just not going to junior, senior. It's not that type of deal, okay? God said, you know what? I'm going to make for you a special partner. I'm going to make for you Eve. And Eve allows for Adam to complete the creation mandate. And that is part of our role in families. And as I look at the relationship of my wife and I, she helps to complete our ability to carry out the creation mandate. And as she and I work together, she supports me, I support her. It's not I am the king of the castle and I command her to do everything. Guys, that does not work, by the way. Don't try it. Listen from the advice of others. And it's not her sitting there in a chair commanding the entire household how to work and telling us how things need to be run. We work together. And we can honor God with the way that we do that. So Adam and Eve, they have dreams of growing old together and living out their days in a nursing home in the Garden of Eden. Oh, no, I don't think that actually would have happened. But unfortunately comes along the first sin. And this comes in Genesis chapter 3, where God had commanded Adam and Eve that they have total reign over the entire Garden of Eden except for what? One tree. What was the name of that tree? Tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You ever stop to think about the name of that tree? Yeah. The knowledge of good and evil. So like you eat that, you're going to know the difference between good and evil. come on, Adam and Eve, think a little bit about the consequence of eating this stuff. But you and I been there, we would have probably done the same thing. And if you think you wouldn't have, if you think, no, man, I would have had self-control and self-restraint, think back to the last time you sinned. Think about the decision you made there. Well, you fell into a sin. Maybe it was this morning, maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was 6 months ago since the last time you sinned. I don't know. But we all make decisions to sin, and God's up there kind of shaking his head going, man, why? What are you thinking? So, every tree except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and Eve then listens to Satan and his lies, so it's all Eve's fault, right?
Yes.
No, it is not Eve's fault. Adam is just as guilty, in fact, perhaps even more than Eve in all of this, because Eve at least had a good excuse that Satan himself came and tempted her, and Adam just went along with what the girl said. Kind of like most blind guys when they're in a dating relationship, when the girl says, hey, let's do this. Oh, okay, sure. Well, let's not go there, but guys need to have a little bit of a spiritual maturity to understand when they're being influenced to do wrong. So Adam, being also the leader, should have acknowledged this was wrong and should not have happened. Now, let's talk about the consequences here for a moment. First of all, sin enters the human race. Man's relationship to God was disrupted. We all know enough about God to know that God cannot stand the sight of sin. He cannot be in the presence of sin, and so that's why he had to cast them out of the Garden of Eden. And so he could not have a close relationship with mankind anymore because there was that sin dividing them. So Adam and Eve are over here, God's now over here, and you have this big wall of sin dividing them, and they're never going to be able to come back together. Man's affection was changed. Instead of their affection being toward God and their focus being on God, it's now on themselves. The earth is going to rebel against them. And instead of the earth working to support mankind, now mankind is going to have to care and tend for the earth, and it is going to fight against mankind. It's part of the reason why the grass won't grow in my backyard. Weeds come up in my garden. It's not a cool thing. So we have a huge problem here. These consequences are significant. But the story does not end there, and we're thankful that it doesn't. From Genesis 3:15, two seeds are promised. I want to read for you Genesis 3:15. And this is after God had discovered their sin. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And so these two seeds or two offsprings are promised. There's the seed of the serpent. So what's the seed of the serpent? Anybody know? What is the offspring or the seed of the serpent? What do you think? Death is part of it. It's actually the generations of people that are going to follow Satan and that are going to deny God. So you're going to have all these people that are going to resist God, and they're going to choose to follow Satan or choose to follow their own path. And then we have the seed of the woman. Who is the seed of the woman? It is Christ and all those that will follow Christ. And in this verse, it says that predicts the future that Christ is going to conquer sin and death and going to destroy the serpent. And this leads to a great conflict throughout all of history. That Satan and his followers are continually going to be battling God and his followers. And a lot of times this springs up, and this is evident in some of the national battles and the arguments that happen in early civilization history. And I'll try to point those out as much as we can as we get to them. It seems like Satan's going to have victory. It seems like when we get to the apex of history, we get to the cross of Christ, that Satan's going to win. But yet we know the end of the story. It seems like even today, we look at our society and we think, man, it seems like Satan's winning. Society is crumbling and people don't care about God anymore. Satan's winning. Yet we have to keep in mind the end of the story, that God is going to get victory in the end. I'm going to pause here for lunch. So you